First up, we see that the system is completely web enabled. I'm running it from Google Chrome, but in theory, you could access the system from any browser on any device. As with any other ERP system, most ERPs are broken up by module. So from our understanding of the requirements, the modules that we intend to implement are obviously the financials. We will require accounts payable and receivable. There will be budgets. There could be fixed assets. We'll talk about that also. And then we need the purchasing module, which sits upon inventory. Now, I know that we don't have much of inventory to deal with, but in order for us to be able to do procurement transactions, we need to have base products in the system that facilitates the union between the procurement and the finance. So most ERP systems are the same. They have pretty much the same modules. What is nice about Sage X3 is that users use the system with an interface-led or a visually aided process into step 1 and step 2 of every single process that needs to be followed by any person from any department. So if I draw your attention to the left of the screen here, you will see different roles in a company. And within that role, and I'll use the example of a buyer here or someone from procurement, within that role, that user could be performing different tasks. For example, someone from purchasing is probably managing suppliers and will follow a process in what managing suppliers mean. Will track things like requests for quotations, manage pricing and contracts with suppliers, work on requisitions, and so on. And whilst they do that, whatever process they follow will have a step-by-step flow in what is needed to take that transaction from one step to the next eventually in its cycle. This is good because it's very, very simple then to use, because all that the user needs to do is click on one of these buttons here, and that then opens up that transaction for use. So although, as Shobha mentioned earlier, Sage X3 is our enterprise offering for Sage, it is also made very simplistic and easy to use for end users. But the benefit, however, is not just for end users, it's also for the stakeholders and the management, because these processes that we have come out of the box when we install and ship X3. Some of them might work for the business out of the box, but others may not. And whilst we study the requirements during the implementation, we'll find that some of these processes need to be altered and modified to suit the actual flow of operations. And these can be done without any customizations through standard process editing from the system. And what we will then be able to achieve is to streamline the processes that you intend for the business to follow. Right. And this, as I said, is available through all areas of the system, not just the procurement module. So I mentioned, though, that visual processes take us from one step to the next. However, in a real world, before transactions actually move from one step to the next, they usually go through an approval process. Approvals for values, approvals for whether it's a legitimate requirement, whatever the requirement may be, but there is always at least one level of approval that happens. And purchasing is a very good example, because in most cases, most purchasing processes go through certain levels of approval as well. Now, this is one of the benefits that Shobha was mentioning earlier of having the procurement as well built inside the ERP system. Because one of the things that you would require is to be able to have budgets in the system, which we will talk about in more detail later. But for now, our understanding is that while we take transactions from one step to the next, there is a need to have transactions approved. And if you look at your screen here, you will see that the system has a workflow engine that allows us to adapt approval cycles following certain workflow rules that we will put into the system, and then apply which users need to approve that transaction before it goes to the next step. Now, in our walkthrough of the procurement system, we will use an example where we take a transaction through and involve an approval cycle as well. All right. Now, I mentioned although earlier that this is a complete web-based system. And in order for the approvals to work efficiently, we need to incorporate the ability to have emails, alerts, and the ability to access the actual ERP system from a mobile platform. Now, whatever I see here, for example, this is a purchase order. Whatever I see here on the screen of the ERP as the transaction is entered can also be accessed on a small device, be it an iPad, tablet, or a phone. But when it opens up on a small device, it opens up on a different interface, one that is optimized for usage on a small device. So from here, you would see that this interface is touch friendly and can be clicked through and accessed to know, for example, your purchase requirements or your expenses that need to be approved or your suppliers, basically anything from the system that you need to query on a small device. So the system comes with it is mobile friendly, and even though you access it from a browser, we have different interfaces that are optimized for usage on small devices. Okay, happy with that? We'll actually go through a process when we start the procurement discussion. All right. So moving forward, I'm going to talk about the group structure in more details later when we look at finance. But for now, I just want to mention that we will be setting up the business or the organization by setting up legal entities. And if the legal entity means that there are multiple branches belonging to that legal entity, then we will set those up as well. This is important because as requisitions come in to the procurement department, they could be coming in from either different departments or different branches, and it's important for the procurement team to identify that when they make decisions and take transactions through its process. Okay, so I'm going to go back now into the procurement cycle, and if it's okay, we will begin a purchase workflow and talk through some of the functionality and capabilities that are available in Sage X3 for the same. So I'm first going to open up what we call a purchase request, also known in other systems as a requisition or an internal request, internal order. They all the same thing. It is basically a need for certain product or service or asset from a user from a department. All right. And this is identified by the specific user code who is making the request. So I mentioned here that this person has logged in and has placed a request from a particular branch. That will generate a unique request number that can be traced and tracked and reported on and managed for its traceability. The request is placed on a certain date and might or might not be related to a specific event or project or cost center, which I'll talk a bit more in details later. The request could be for a certain product. So this one is already entered. I'm going to create a new one just now. So I'm creating a new request. Select the product that is being requested, and that will bring down the description of the product, which you might be able to, or you might need to expand with more description and a short note on what the user is expecting. You specify the request date when, so you're requesting it on this date, but when you need the actual item or the article, the unit, how much of that product is required, and you might or might not have a suggestion on which supplier to choose. Now, the supplier field here is optional, and the reason is because the request might or might not have the authority to specify where they want it sourced from. You then have a list of different options that you could choose from in terms of how you categorize the different cost centers or profit centers, or basically the different allocation components within the business. So this could be a project as mentioned here. This could also be a cost center, a product line, a market, a site, a branch. And these are basically the different dimensions that we will bring into the system. I'll be talking a bit more about that later. But essentially, when we budget, when we budget for spend or costs, we can budget within these dimensional components. And when we look at dimensions, we'll see how to put those budgets into the system. So once I've completed with the elements that are part of that request, I save it, and the system generates then a request number, a unique request number, as can be done, as you can see here. I would also like to draw your attention to the signature. Remember, we spoke about workflow. So this then says that a request has been placed by this user ERPUS and has currently not been signed off as yet. From here, the requester can then see through a signature history or a signature circuit which users have approved and which users have not yet approved this transaction. Okay, so if at all the request is held up, he knows who it's sitting with and who it is, who he needs to chase to get that approval done more quickly. Now we can see here that this request has to be approved by user 1. So what I will do now is I will log out of the system and log into user 1. So I'm going to close this. And just before I do that, I will also open up Outlook. And in my inbox, you will see that there is a new request in the system today. And on that request, there is some certain text. Now, this bit of text here is modifiable. It's basically up to you to decide how you want to, what clauses and paragraphs you want to put in there and how you want to construct the mail body of that request. But very importantly, from the email itself, you will have a button to sign or accept the request, and then another button to reject it. But it might be that in order for you to do that, to make that decision, you want to be able to see the request on your screen. And remember, this mail can be opened up from a desktop or from your phone, which in that case, you would need to access it with a different interface that we've seen earlier. So before I approve this, let me log into the system as user 1 to see how he sees that request. So I'm going to change the user now. I'm going to be user 01. And user 1 is, let's say, the user who's responsible for ensuring that approvals are done purchase order. That all approvals are signed off before they become purchase orders or before they move to an RFP process. So every user, just like they have the visual processes, will also have a dashboard of critical reports or inquiries that are relevant to their role in the business. So a buyer or a person or a purchase manager can see here which requests they have to sign and other details related either to approvals or to reports on their dashboard. So you could have requests, orders, historical data all set up as different tabs on the user's dashboard. And this, of course, my example here is for procurement, but it applies to all users of the business. I'll go now to the last request that needs to be signed off. And you can see here that this was the request that was just created by ERP user, but it's sitting on my dashboard now and from here, I will be able to accept or reject it. Okay. And if I wanted to go into more details, I can open it up. So we know that from a desktop, you will have a dashboard that allows the users to see what's next on their table for approval. But just going back to the previous interface that we spoke of, you would also be able to access the system from the email that you receive, and you can access it either from the desktop or from a mobile device. So if I click now the mobile interface from the email, the system will open up that specific request so you can see who has approved, who has requested, what is the text, what needs to be signed, and other details. So for example, if you needed to see budget value or committed value, that can also be placed here. And then from that, you would be able to then accept or reject the purchase request. Okay. And only once it is accepted will it be able to do the next step.